Baltimore in the late 1800s was a city of old money and proud Southern heritage. On one side stood the Warfield family, iron-fisted Northern entrepreneurs with deep Baltimore roots. On the other stood the Montagues, Gentile Virginians with plantations in their past and faded aristocracy in their name. Teackle Wallis Warfield, born 1869, was the youngest son of Henry Warfield, a Baltimore grain merchant and railroad executive. Henry Warfield was a pillar of the city's Gilded Age commerce. He co-founded the Baltimore Chamber of Commerce, helped build grain elevators and steamship lines, and even ran, unsuccessfully, for mayor in 1875. His wife was Anna Emory Warfield. Through Henry, Teackle inherited a proud lineage stretching back to colonial America. One family legend held that a medieval ancestor, Pagan de Warfield, fought at Hastings in 1066. In Baltimore's Mount Vernon Square, there still stands a statue of Teackle Wallis, the distinguished 19th-century jurist after whom Teackle was named. Henry's other sons included Solomon Davies Warfield, a banker and railroad president, and Daniel and Richard Warfield, all prominent in Baltimore society. The Warfields were respected, wealthy patrician folk in the city, known for their Protestant work ethic and civic leadership. Alice Montague was born in 1869 into another storied family. Her father, William Latane Montague, 1824 to 1909, came from Old Virginia gentry. William Montague had left his native Buckingham County, Virginia, in the 1840s for Baltimore, where he became a successful stockbroker and merchant. In the Civil War, he even covertly ran guns for the Confederacy, despite living in Maryland. He married Sally Howard Love of Baltimore, and they had 5 children. Alice was the baby of the family. Through her father, Alice could trace descent from early colonial stock. Her ancestors included the 17th-century Montague family of England, who settled in Virginia in 1621 on royal grants. But by the 1890s, the Montagues were no longer rich plantation owners. William's fortunes waxed and waned, and by midlife, he returned to Richmond after his first wife's death. Alice's eldest sister Bessie, 1864 to 1964, would marry well and live to 100. Younger brother William Jr. moved to North Carolina. In Baltimore, the Montagues were regarded as genteel, but somewhat nouveau. The Warfields viewed them as lively Southern upstarts, and the Montagues felt the Warfields lacked pedigree. In short, Teackle Warfield grew up among Baltimore bankers and industrialists, while Alice Montague was a Virginia beauty from an aristocratic but not especially wealthy family. Both families boasted Confederate sympathies. Teackle's father had even been briefly imprisoned by Lincoln's Union government in 1861. But by the 1890s, each clan was firmly rooted in Baltimore's high society. As Wallis Simpson herself later noted, both families were elite, patrician in American terms. And yet they were very different kinds of elite. The Warfields were staunch Northern Protestants who prized industry and civic duty, while the Montagues embraced a more romantic Southern tradition. Against this backdrop of class and culture clashed the romance of Teackle Warfield and Alice Montague. They likely met in Baltimore society, but neither family warmly approved of the match. Teackle was already ill. He suffered from tuberculosis, and Alice was young and vivacious. By 1895, the couple knew they would soon have a child. Rather than announce a hasty engagement, they eloped quietly. In fact, a contemporary wedding announcement reveals that Teackle and Alice were married on November 19, 1895, at St. Michael and All Angels Episcopal Church in Baltimore. According to one account, the ceremony took place in the rector's study, with only a few friends present. Wallis Simpson later recalled her parents' marriage as either that day or another in June 1895. But official records, and the timing of her birth, make November more likely. The newlywed Warfields escaped town to Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, a cool mountain resort on the Mason-Dixon line. Teackle's health was failing, and in the summer of 1896 doctors thought the fresh air might help. They took a little wooden cottage behind the Monterey Inn, a Victorian hotel retreat. There, Alice went into labour unexpectedly. On June 19, 1896, Bessie Wallis Warfield was born in that square cottage. She was named Bessie for Alice's sister and Wallis for Teackle's namesake, the Maryland jurist. The baby's arrival was a private affair. There was no official birth certificate, and even the local doctor barely made it from Baltimore in time. Teackle was too ill to travel, so Alice brought him the newborn just after birth. "She has the Warfield look," Teackle reportedly said of little Wallis, "but let us hope that in spirit she'll be like you, a Montague." Tragically, Teackle never recovered. By summer's end, the family had returned to Baltimore, and the 27-year-old father's tuberculosis worsened. Teackle died on November 15, 1896. Little Wallis was not even 5 months old. His obituary noted TB as the cause, and newspapers remembered him only as a young man cut down in his prime. For Alice, the widowhood was devastating. She was suddenly a penniless young mother with an infant daughter. The Warfield and Montague families had shunned their marriage, and now Alice found herself with no husband and little support. Only Teackle's relatives stepped forward. His widowed mother, Anna Emery Warfield, took Alice and Bessie into her home. More important was Teackle's younger brother, Solomon Davies Warfield, a successful banker and railroad president. Solomon, a lifelong bachelor, became Wallis's guardian and patron. He invited Alice and the baby to live in his grand Baltimore row house, a 4-story home on Preston Street, and provided for them. As biography.com notes, Alice and Wallis were thereafter dependent upon the charity of Solomon Warfield. Solomon even paid for Wallis's education. Later, he enrolled her at Oldfield School, Maryland's most expensive girls' academy. In the first years after Teackle's death, then, Wallis's upbringing was shaped by her widowed mother and her uncle's household. Alice threw herself into caring for her daughter and earning what little income she could. By Wallis's later account, Alice was a party-loving, free-spirited Southern belle who tried to maintain independence, sewing and selling embroidered handicrafts, taking in boarders, even running a small restaurant, but never made much money. Wallis grew up amidst wariness and whispered disapproval. Her Montague kin disdained the sombre Warfields as dors nouveau riche, and the Warfields fretted that the delicate Teackle had married below his station. As one biographer notes, the Warfields worried Teackle would never be strong enough to support a wife. In any case, the young Wallis was reared in a household where respectability was expected, but funds were tight, and where her uncle quietly called the financial shots. To understand Teackle and Alice's world, we must picture Baltimore at the turn of the century. This was a booming port and railroad hub. Grain from the Midwest, sugar, coffee, and raw materials flowed down the Patapsco River, managed by powerful local merchants. Teackle's grandfather, Henry Warfield, had helped build that economy. In the decades after the Civil War, he expanded into railroads and shipping. He was a grain merchant, instrumental in building the grain elevators in Baltimore's Canton Warehouse neighborhood, and he co-founded the city's Chamber of Commerce and even a steamship company to Cuba. Men like Henry M. Warfield formed the backbone of Baltimore's elite, men who ran businesses, sat on boards, and served in civic roles. Henry's own reputation was such that a contemporary called him one of the best-known and personally one of the most popular citizens of Baltimore. In 1875, he ran for mayor on a reform ticket. Solomon Warfield would follow similar paths in finance and railroads. These were old Baltimore families, socially connected, well-bred, and profit-minded. Alice's family, by contrast, embodied the last vestiges of the Old South transplanted to Maryland. The Montagues traced their ancestry to English colonial aristocracy. Alice's father, William L. Montague, had once been a rich investor and, during the war, even a Confederate secret agent. But by the 1890s, his fortunes had faded. The Montagues in Baltimore were still considered genteel. Alice's sister Bessie made a good marriage. Yet observers noted that the Montagues, whatever their past prosperity as landowners, were no longer prosperous. In fact, Montague relatives worried that their beautiful, vivacious Alice had a much better match available than the ailing Teackle Warfield. Thus, though both sides were proud of their southern credentials, they viewed status quite differently. Wallis later wrote that she felt the best of both worlds, her party-loving, free-spirited southern Montague heritage and her hard-driving northern Warfield one. In the broader society of Baltimore, these tensions played out in everyday life. The city's class system was rigid. Upper-class women like Alice wore fine clothes, led charitable societies, and hosted salons, while men managed businesses and politics. Even Baltimore's famous Corset Society and YWCA were organized along racial and class lines in this era. Wealthy families often intermarried, so the Warfields and Montagues moving in the same circles was natural, but prejudices lingered. When an English princess, later called Wallis the lowest of the low, biographers noted that she did come from two elite families. It was only her father's death and a lack of unbroken wealth that made her situation tenuous. Economically, Baltimore was dynamic. Streetcars electrified the streets, factories hummed, and immigrants streamed in. Against this bustling backdrop, Teackle took on his wife. But even wealth had limits. As a sickly man, he could not build a fortune, and the Montagues' faded glory could not rescue a young widow. Gender norms of the era dictated that Alice's role was domestic. There were few career options for a woman of her class except teaching, nursing, or running a home. By contrast, the Maryland Suffrage Association would not even form until 1894, so women's public rights were still in their infancy. In practice, this meant Alice had to marry up or lean on her late husband's family. And that is exactly what happened. Even as Alice tried to assert some independence, selling crafts and taking lodgers, it was the Warfields who ultimately provided support. Thus, Teackle and Alice's marriage sat at the intersection of Baltimore's Gilded Age class and cultural currents, between old Southern honor and new Northern capitalism, between Victorian gender expectations and the stirrings of the new woman. Their story, a brief spark of love sealed by early tragedy, reflects all those forces. When Teackle died, he left no will and only a brief legacy to his daughter. Wallis Simpson grew up never knowing her father except through hearsay and a single photograph. Alice, still mourning, struggled to care for her baby on a Warfield allowance. According to Wallis's biographers, her young mother sold embroidery in the local craft exchange, took in lodgers and started a restaurant, trying in every way she could to be independent. But the hard truth was that Wallis and Alice had to rely on the Warfield family's charity. Solomon Warfield provided a home and schooling for Wallis, but his generosity was grudging. He maintained irregular allowances for Alice and the child. Sometimes there was money, sometimes there was none. As Anne Seber notes, little Wallis learned early, you have to rely on a man in those days. A lesson born of Uncle Solomon's unpredictable support. Growing up in Uncle Sol's household meant Wallis was always aware of her precarious place. She and her mother lived upstairs in the big Preston Street house, yet had to watch the Warfields' rules. Wallis later complained that she and Alice had no steady family funds and were always outsiders in the clan. At home, Alice instilled in her daughter the proud traditions of the Montague side. Gone with the wind, Southern flair, loyalty to family, and a belief in social grace. Wallis described her mother as party-loving, free-spirited, a true Southern beauty, and she absorbed that confidence. From her father's Warfield side came a sense of ambition and propriety. Teackle's last words, that she had the Warfield look and should have Montague's spirit, became something of a personal motto. Growing up, Wallis learned to value poise and appearance. She kept immaculate clothes, studied manners, and even had a dressmaker copy fashions from magazines to stretch her wardrobe. Education and social position were Uncle Solomon's contributions. He paid Wallace's school fees and chose a traditional path. Between 1912 and 1914, she attended Oldfield School, Maryland's most expensive girls' boarding school. By all reports, Wallis thrived there, topping her class and mixing with heiresses like Renée Dupont. Solemite condescension aside, the Warfield investment in his niece's manners paid dividends. As Wallis grew, the combined legacies of her parents shaped her. She inherited Alice's flair and rumoured aristocratic airs, and her father's name gave her an aura of old Baltimore respectability. Her pride in lineage was genuine. She boasted of being patrician, and a 1970s social commentator quipped that by British standards, her family background put her well above most American belles. Still, the early loss of her father cast a long shadow. Wallis felt she never truly belonged, either in the Warfield mansion or in Baltimore society. Even as her mother remarried in 1908, Alice wed John Freeman Racine, son of the Democratic boss Isaac Racine. Wallis clung to her Warfield name, dropping Bessie as childish and insisting on the more masculine Wallace. In a way, Wallis spent her youth reassembling the family legacy her parents had left behind. In the Warfield household, she saw wealth and power. In her Montague blood, she heard echoes of the Old South. Teackle's dying wish that Wallis have the Warfield look, but be like her mother, became a personal creed as Wallis set out on her own path. It would take her far beyond Baltimore, but throughout her life she carried the imprint of Teackle and Alice, the determination of her mother and the polish of her father's clan. Their brief marriage had ended in tragedy, but its legacy endured in the little girl they had brought into the world, a legacy that would one day place Wallis Simpson at the centre of history.